All right, so we are starting a really fun episode of Dissecting DevOps with Dave and Chris, and we're going to cover the 7 hues of DevOps. So I think Dave noticed early on that we use color terminology a lot to represent different aspects of the DevOps environment. So we're going to go through all that we have identified. If you know of any others, please put them in the comments and let us know, because it was kind of fun coming up with this list here. So what's interesting, Dave, about the first three is they are all about deployments. I wonder why that is.
That's a great concept, and I've never quite thought about it that way, Chris. But I think it's because deployments actually power everything that we do.
That's
If we
true.
can't get it out there in the first place, it doesn't matter what else we do.
Yeah, I guess.
So think about the number of times. I know you've experienced this. I've experienced this. Think about the number of times your deployment fails, and now we can't afford to have things fail and close the business. And so I think we've seen a lot of deployment stuff simply because the business can't afford to be down.
Yeah, there is a lot of thought and energy put into deployment and how we deploy. So the first one is blue green deployments. What does that mean, Dave?
So blue green is to a deployment. It's a deployment rollout strategy that happens. And what I'm going to do is I'm going to set up environments that have the new stuff and I know that the old stuff is still running. And so one side blue, one side green here. And then I'm going to load balance and let requests go to each of those two environments and monitor both those environments. And that would give me information that's actually twofold here. One, I can baseline against the established environment. So using the blue as the older environment, I know what the blue is doing, and I can actually baseline it. So I understand what's going on. And once I'm comfortable, then I can shift all of my load balance traffic off to the green side. But I am comfortable. And say that something comes up, and all of a sudden my request rate is taking 5 times longer on my green side, I just load balance the traffic back to the blue side. So my downtime is never there. Honestly, in fact, even imagine that you have an error that shows up on the green side during a request. The person retries, or we automatically retry the request. The load balancer is likely to shift it to the blue side as well as to the green side. So the end user may not have any interruption basis that happened there.
So thinking about kind of the business case of this, and like you said, everything is about deployments. It's really reducing the mean time to value, right? So getting the
Yes.
functionality out the door and kind of mitigating that fear of every time we deploy something, all hell breaks loose.
Right. Yeah, and keep in mind that especially as we move to the cloud native, the microservices space, we can be deploying things in micro bits as well. So we could do a microservice blue green without having to do an entire environment blue green.
Right.
And this means we're even compartmentalizing down a little farther to this and being able to isolate really fast. So that time to value for functionality going on. Unfortunately, as a former developer here, it's not unheard of to put in some stupid thing during testing and then forget to remove it during production. And blue green will find that really, really fast.
Yeah, configuration drift is such a that's a whole big fascinating topic. But one of the things that you just mentioned, and this is going to be true for all the deployment ones, is the architecture side of this is really interesting, because I think you go to a company and you explain, okay, I get it, I get blue green, that's really cool, and maybe they have the reaction like, why aren't we doing this? But if you haven't thought about the architecture of how you're going to do it, then it's hard to be successful. It's not like one day you can just modify something in your load balancer and you're set up for success. You also have to know visibility. How are you going to monitor each deployment? And to your point, what is the criteria for validating a recent
Yeah.
deployment?
Yeah, you also have to keep in mind that there is a resource issue that comes up here. If I'm running both versions at the same time, I've got to have resources to run both versions at the same
Right?
time.
So let's talk about the next one, which is actually really similar, and I think some would argue the same thing, but I think it's worth exploring, which is red black deployments. So what's the difference there?
Yeah, and this one was kind of interesting because I'd never really quite run into it until we started getting into discussing the various hues that show up in DevOps here. But and there are lots, Istio, Kubernetes, and all. They basically say red black deployments are the same. But when you look at it definitionally, they aren't quite the same inside of here. So when we're doing the red black environments, again, we are having the old environment and the new environment, and they're going to simultaneously run. But rather than the purely the load balance viewpoint where things could retry and go back to the other one, the request is limited to that side. So if I retry, I'm on black and I retry, I'm going back to black. If I retry on red, I'm going back to red. And I don't have crossover that happens in those request bases. Now, again, think orchestration and think service meshes. Those are basically the same thing. I'm talking to something else that's now controlling my communication pathways. So they do kind of overlap a little bit. Red black is probably best suited for, I hate to say this, critical missions where you need to know instantly that there is a problem. It probably finds problems faster than blue green because blue green can be masked because of the retries. Oh, it didn't go through, it didn't go through, oh, it succeeded. And that becomes a duration issue rather than an error issue. Red, black, it didn't go through, it didn't go through, it's an error, and you know it.
So that's where my brain goes as well, is a failure in red and black is going to be more catastrophic,
Yes.
and but you're going to be very aware of it. So I think that that's a good analogy, because from a user perspective in a blue green scenario, you may not know, you might have some annoyance, but you may not know. Red black, you're
It,
probably going to know.
right, and it's probably a duration thing here. Oh, my request for everybody else took 50 milliseconds, and this one took 5 seconds in a blue green environment. You're not going to have that hit you in red black. So this is where we start looking at that the tracing aspects to give us an idea of what's going on
Right.
time wise.
Which I guess, to that point, depending on how you set your alerts and your threshold and all of that logic, I feel like red black may be easier to some degree because you have some subjectivity in blue green.
Yes. Yeah, I think you're right. Blue green. So blue green, yeah, load balancers are tailorable, but I don't know the specific load I may be throwing at either side. It's load balancer based. Red black, I know the loads I'm throwing at each side. I know specifically what loads I'm throwing at each side. And so it's probably easier to simply suddenly say, oh, everything coming from here is going to the black side and everything coming from here is going to the red side. And I think that they're so similar, it's hard to say, but I can actually see advantages for both pieces. Um, I also will tell you that just from thinking about this problem a little bit, I feel like red black will fit hybrid clouds better than a blue green
Oh,
model,
that's interesting. Or
where
even
part of my
multi-cloud, I
stuff
guess.
is,
Yeah.
yeah, or even multi-cloud, and that'll help me isolate the cloud and communication differentials from the versioning differentials.
That's interesting. Okay. So next one, yellow, canary, canary yellow. Yeah, we cheated a little bit. So deal with it. So so Canary, I remember the early days of when Canary releases came out. It was very similar to the reaction to the term DevOps, where people are like, this is insane. And then the next thing you heard is like, yeah, but Google is releasing new functionality out to its users, on a daily basis, and they're just throwing that stuff out there. And essentially, what it is, canary in the coal mine, you send it out, you see what happens, which is similar to blue, green, and red, black. And if it doesn't work, you bring it back. But, and correct me if I'm wrong, I feel like Canary release is more of focused on feature functionality than just
It,
deployment.
Yeah, it actually, I think that you're spot on here, Chris. So in my former company, we used to roll things out in a Canary basis. We were 100% SaaS model for this. And what we would do is we'd roll it out, staging it over time. And that would give us the ability to, I'm going to use a phrase, test the water a little bit and see whether the water was ice cold or hot. And then if it was one way, we can add a little bit more, we can add a little bit more, we can add a little bit more. We actually did have an issue once that Canary caught that the others would not have caught as quickly. The first rollout was 20. We would do a 20, 50, 100% rollout. So 20% new, 50% new, 100% new. Everything's going out for this. And everything, and we were fixing a particular problem. And they fixed at the low rates, and it fixed at 20 rates, and moderate degradation that actually started showing up at 50%. And so it was a load issue rather than a functionality issue. And Canary caught that for us, whereas blue, green, and red, black would not have caught that for us.
That's interesting. Some of the ways that I've been obsessed with Canary, because it has come up, and companies want to embrace this, but one of the things that I kind of have an assumption around is that in order for it to be effective and you actually test the functionality, is you have to have some significant amount of users or transactions.
Yes,
Like there has to be a good enough volume that segmenting your user base with one new feature is a meaningful full test. Right? If you
right.
have 10 active users at any given time and you only test one.
Right. That's actually a really fair point. Is that Canary is really a lot around in the way that I've used it before around sort of load. And if you can't put the system under load, Canary by itself won't help you.
That's interesting,
But,
right? It's not by itself. Now I'm
yeah, I
curious.
think at least to your user base. If you've got 10 people using it and you roll out a 10% change, it's probably not going to show you much. If you have 10,000 people hitting it and you roll out a 10% change, you probably got a few people that are going to be irked at you if things break. So,
Right.
yeah,
It's interesting. And again, it's about time to value, getting functionality, but I also think it's about experimentation and fail fast, which is also somewhat different than blue, green, red, black. The other thing that I wanted to say about Canary, which I think is interesting, is that the utilization of the feature flag design pattern must support this.
very good point. I quite often think, and that's why you balance me so well here, is that I quite often think like a developer. I don't think quite often around the feature flag basis, but you're right. This is something that you can't suddenly wake up in the morning and say, I'm going to do Canary. You've actually got to plan it out a little bit ahead of time to make sure that your staging is correct. So good call out, Chris.
Oh, thank you, Dave. So the three that we just did, I think what's interesting about all of these is they're around deployments. We've already said it, and getting functionality out there faster, and also getting to this continuous delivery concept where code gets committed, it passed through some series of tests, and it gets deployed. All of these, I think, imply two key things, and actually end up leading into our others is visibility. You have to have visibility and automation. Like you can't expect that these practices are going to create the visibility and automation for you. You actually have to think ahead about those things.
Yeah, your automation point is another one of those that devs don't think about the same way for here. But every one of these cannot be manually controlled, at least at scale.
Yeah,
And so you need to be able to, for instance, push Canary and say, okay, it's going to be 20% for this period, and it's be go to 50% or 40%, and it's going to stage up. But you don't want somebody sitting there on the keyboard waiting to push the return key, 10 minutes or 2 hours into it. You really need it to be automated.
Reminds me of the days of release managers and release management. It's super fascinating.
So I have to flash back because I do remember once where there was a company where we had a press release that was supposed to go out at 6 a.m. and the person that was responsible for it had her finger posed over the return key, watching the clock count down. Nowadays we just automate it. So
Yeah. So now this is another really interesting well, not new, but kind of a melding. So this idea of purple team, where did this come from?
I have to admit this was one of them that I found while we were doing research for this discussion as well. And it actually turns out there are red teams, blue teams. And it came out, I think, of either the Department of Defense or the Army, or I mean, it doesn't have to. I don't remember if it was the U.S. that came out here. And basically, what it is, the red team's job is to attack, the blue team's job is to defend. And this got adopted into basically security testing constructs, first of all. And then it became a generalized testing for potential concerns across the board. So the red team attacks. I'm going to go penetrate. I'm going to go find all the bugs. I'm going to go hack the heck out of you here. The blue team's job is I'm going to find that you're hacking and I'm going to stop those holes as soon as possible. And what happened was the red team and the blue team became super aggressively competitive, and we failed to actually get to what we needed to do, which was to fix the problem, fix the code here. So purple, let's put the two teams so that their transparency and communication flows. And so the red team can go, I'm going to try attacking this way. And the blue team can come back and say, oh, this is what happened when you did this. And this is what happened when I tried to stop you this way. And so purple became a more cooperative environment in here. The interesting thing, and you're actually a little bit better at some of the chaos side for this, is that purple, the testing concepts, a purple team match really well to chaos engineering. Okay, we quite often go after chaos engineering, which says, oh, what happens when I do this? And you're responsible for both sides. The problem is that if you are expecting a result, you tend to bias towards getting that result. If you have another person in the loop, you may be expecting a result, but they're going to be observing what the result is. And the purple team still allows that communication to go back and forth. And so chaos engineering and purple testing, purple teaming fit really well hand to hand. And that's actually, you mentioned earlier, that's something we could probably dive a little deeper into as well. We should probably do that.
The topic of chaos engineering is fun for so many reasons, but the term chaos, I think, is where it falls flat very quickly for a lot of organizations, even though the reality is what you're doing is preparing for things that are inevitably going to happen probably anyway. So you're just preparing. Now, what's interesting is when people talked about chaos engineering initially, like the response is, oh, you implement Chaos Monkey. I'm doing Chaos Monkey, so we are doing chaos engineering. Well, the problem with that, and this is where I think Purple Team creates an analogy to it, or it is the practice of it, is how do you manage the practice of chaos engineering? So how do you record your tests, what happened, how you did it, how you responded to it, and then what the action is, the remediation. And most of the platforms coming out today around chaos engineering are exactly that. They're like management tools for your testing, your actual chaos. And I feel like Purple Team brings that together as well, because you're right. You have to complete the feedback loop. You can't just say, I hacked you, I won. I defended you, I won. Now let's do it again. You have to say, what do we learn in this process? Because sometimes what you learn is not as obvious as we have an exploit. It could be something around, you know, efficiencies and processes and automation and other things that are not directly bugs, for example.
That's actually, I think that's spot on, very honestly. So Yes, I think we need to dive a little bit more into purple and chaos at some point in
Yeah,
time too.
yeah, I like it. But you notice how I mean, that's why we made this whole thing is the terminology in the industry is crazy and we add to it, but we also try to disambiguate it. So the next one, right? This is another one that came from our friends over at Google, like a lot of things, SRE and Canary, I believe. Golden signals.
Oh, lest we forget. So Golden Signals came out in the wonderful SRE handbook as a way of keeping track of the overall health of your environment. And I'm using the word environment very deliberately here. And so Golden Signals broke down into latency, errors, saturation, and traffic, which pretty much tries to cover both the infrastructure aspects as well as the communication and request aspects in four very concrete metrics for this. Golden Signals, when it came out, was groundbreaking. It was the first time that we started looking at modern monitoring practices in conjunction with modern applications and architectures. And again, you still have people use them, but what you find is that the overlap between these two is significant, but they're correlated, not interrelated. And so, when we get into the next couple, because I happen to know the next couple really, really well here. We'll find that we did need to expand a little bit to be able to really get comprehensive monitoring for both sides.
You're starting to see this a lot with in the industry. You see it with something called Dora metrics, and other things that kind of get thrown out there by a big name. Dora actually eventually became Google also. What I like about them, the good and the bad. So what I like about them is that it forces companies to think in a better way. So it's good to think about having kind of a well-established standard metrics that you measure your application by. But it's not actually a standard. So when they start to think of it, this is the end all be all, we're done, like we're as good as Google as soon as we do this, that's where I think you run into problems. And very deliberately, the next two slides were put together um, for this reason, because it isn't the end all be all, but it is good to start. It is good to start to think about your environment in these terms. But everybody wants those metrics that are like, these are the precise metrics and the only metrics, and you're good to go. And the next one, which this might as well just be your name, Dave, or Dave Red McOut. No, that doesn't have a ring to it. But Red metric.
Yeah, so we'll go with Red Dave. That's it, Red Dave, for this. So yes, I am enthralled with Red, and my hat tip out to Tom Wilkie, who came up with this concept of Red. Red stands for rate, error, and duration. And it's really targeted at request-based traffic. Was originally designed for microservices. And it tells me all of the information I need about what my application is doing so that I can, in a sense, proxy user happiness. And that's the reason I love it for this. Users only care that their request, singular, success or failure, how long it took. And Red gives me that, but it gives me the ability to look at it over the entire system. So I can say the requests are coming in. I've got 20 requests per second coming in here. My average latency, or my P90 latency, is running 500 milliseconds, and my error rate is less than 1. Everybody's probably happy for this. So Red gives me the insights to the application space, especially as we get into complex and ephemeral environments that we can't get other places.
And to your point, approximation for user happiness, and this gets to the final one, I think, as well, is that we're building applications for the user. Today, your application being down is not the only indicator of user happiness. Latency is a big component to user happiness, especially if it's anything dealing with personal information. When you click the button and you have to wait a long time, you get very nervous very quickly. So I think that's an important point because I think SREs are not just about on-call outages, right? They're thinking strategically about what do we do to be customer obsessed and work backward from that. So metrics are great. And but sometimes you want to peer into the box, but sometimes you don't want to peer into the box. Like you want to have both levels of understanding. So we have this idea of black and white box monitoring. And Dave's going to explain what that means to us. But one thing I'll say is that it's really focused on input and output. And output, remember, is your user, right? So sometimes we are trained to make the metric our customer, service the metric. Back in monolithic deployment days, your customer oftentimes felt like the server, not the person using the server, but the server itself. And I think it's kind of a mindset shift to say, no, it's our users. Like we really need to be thinking about our users, which starts to propagate some of the ideas about like real user monitoring and the importance of getting that level of data. So I've gone in too deep, but Dave, why don't you explain to us black and white box monitoring?
You can think of black box monitoring as starting by what we used to call health checks. Is it running? Is it there? Are the lights blinking inside of here? If I ping it, does it give me a "oh, I'm okay" message in here? But we actually didn't know anything that was going on inside of it for this. And what happened was that when we had that old monolithic one server, one application type environment, it was pretty clean. If you pinged the application and said, "Hey, I'm okay," health check wise, you were done. And you can even look at this a little bit at the as that old Nagios monitoring was really kind of a extended black box monitoring. What's happened now is that we don't own the boxes a lot, and we've got hundreds, possibly thousands of little boxes that are going on, and we now need to know what the function going on within the larger box to the smaller boxes is. That's where the concept of observability actually came in, honestly, for this. So white boxing gives me the functional activity going on with inside of my application and infrastructure versus simply a health check model about what's going on inside of here. That gives me the ability to start diagnosing a lot tighter. And it's an interesting concept, but basically it's, oh, I can't see into the box and I can see into the box. And people get to decide which way they want to go here. Personally, I'm nosy. I want to know. I want to know everything that's going on everywhere all the time. So I'm really a favor of give me the data. I'll figure out what to do with it.
What I do think about, it's mostly mental overhead, but the overhead of the monitoring. So at some point, is it better just to kind of get the high level, move on? And one of the things that's interesting that our SRE team does, and if I were to correlate this back to red metrics, is that we have team level metrics for everybody. So that means I'm a new engineer. I can hop into the dashboard. I understand what is going on. But then at the service level, they get into much more detail and their metrics start to align with the contract their service has with other services. But they also want to go into the like service map. Like they want to see the details of what's going on. And so I like to make sure that you have that opportunity to dive in. I think analysis paralysis is something that I am always fearful of for teams where they get hung up on the details that may not matter, but that's a matter of discipline as well. So
Yeah, and keep in mind that you don't have to do an either or here. Part of your stuff could be
right.
one side, part of your stuff could be the other side. It's also around how you aggregate. When we're getting data at nanosecond speeds, nobody's going to sit there and watch nanoseconds of log files go past, flying past their screen for this. And so we need to be able to aggregate them into useful blocks. And we also need to be able to do the analysis work. Hopefully, maybe a little AI ML helping us with some of that analysis work here, and then sensible visualization. Without those three things, white box is worthless. So you've got to be able to get aggregation, analysis, and visualization in here so that we can respond as we need to.